Hello and welcome to the second episode of Talking Elections and COVID-19, a video series from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. In each episode, we ask election experts from around the country for their insights on a particular topic. And here to introduce today's topic, as well as today's guests, is Charles Stewart, the director of the Election Lab. Hello, Charles.
Hi, Claire, and thanks a lot. I'm really excited today to have our two guests, Meagan Wolfe and Barry Burden. Meagan is the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, and Barry holds the Lyons Family Chair of Electoral Politics at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And he's also the director of the Elections Research Center there. The topic today, not surprisingly, is the primary that was held in Wisconsin last Tuesday, and in particular what we can learn from what happened on Tuesday as we think about the other primaries that are going to be coming up and the general election in November. So to start things off, I want to turn to Meagan. And before asking any kind of substantive questions, there's a couple of things about Wisconsin that I think are distinctive compared to most states. You have a commission, don't have a secretary of state who runs things. And then I think you have something like 24% of all the local election jurisdictions in the nation. And so if you could just tell us about what difference it makes that you have a commission and that you have all these local jurisdictions. I mean, kind of, what does that say about Wisconsin and why is that important?
Sure. Well, thanks, Charles, and thanks for having me. And, like you said, Wisconsin, we do things differently here than a lot of other states in how we run elections. So we like to claim that we are the most decentralized election administration system in the country. And that's because, unlike other states, we run elections at the municipal level. So that means each city, town, and village has a local election official, and there are 1,850 of them, in addition to our 72 counties that also play a role in elections. And so this is really different than other states that might have 50 to maybe 100 county election officials. All of those election officials have to register voters, send out absentees, set up their polling place, train their poll workers. All of those things fall on the municipality. Another thing, like you mentioned, that's different about us is that here in Wisconsin, I'm the chief election official for the state. In most other states, that would be the secretary of state, who's an elected official. We're overseen by a bipartisan commission, so a 6-member commission with majority and minority leadership appointing those commissioners. And I think how that makes things really different here is that it means all the decisions that are made regarding election administration happen at a public meeting. So all the decisions we make about how we're going to run elections, how we're going to administer them, they happen during public meetings. And lately, we've been having them almost daily where the public can watch the decision-making process unfold. And so this is very different than in other places. We also have very limited authority to be able to change any of the election procedures. So dates, deadlines, processes, all of those are really explicit within statute. And our job is purely to administer and implement those laws. We don't have the ability to change them or make declarations about how things should be different. We really are just here to support those many local election officials and to implement the laws or the court decisions as they're issued to us.
Great, thanks. So let's start with in-person voting, which got a lot of attention this time around. Going in the days leading up to the election, there were worries that some towns might not be able to open any of the polling places at all. In some towns, it doesn't look like that happened, but there were some places like Milwaukee, Green Bay particularly, that had difficulty opening all of the polling places that they had hoped. So the first thing is that were polling place closures more common than in other places beyond Green Bay and Milwaukee? And then thinking broadly, how are y'all thinking about the issue of keeping as many polling places as you need open as you now begin to focus on November?
Great. So in terms of polling place closures, so the first thing is in all of Wisconsin's 1,850 municipalities, they were able to open the polls on election day. So it's not as if there were communities that didn't have a polling place open. What happened was there was a lot of consolidation. So if typically a polling place served only one or two reporting units or wards, it may have been accommodating many wards, 20 plus wards in a consolidated polling place. And so that was a big difference from what we see typically in most jurisdictions. And yes, that did happen in a lot of communities around the state where they chose to consolidate it. There may have been a few factors that led to them making those decisions. One was, like you said, the shortage of poll workers. So in the weeks leading up to the election, we sent a survey to the local elections officials and asked them to identify any poll worker shortages. And we asked them to identify those within categories, critical shortages, meaning that they didn't have enough staff to even open one polling place, serious shortages, which meant that they didn't have enough staff to sort of comfortably be able to open the polling places as they had intended. And I think based on some of that reporting, it led to a lot of the consolidation because they were working off of what they had in terms of poll workers. Since we got those survey results, and there were about 111 jurisdictions that expressed a critical shortage, so meaning they weren't able at the time to even staff a polling place, and about 126 that identified a serious shortage. And with that information, we were able to put out additional calls to people around the state to ask for their service in this capacity. There was also a call to state employees. And then probably the biggest call and the biggest need that we were able to help coordinate in filling was working with the National Guard to train them as civilians in plain clothes to work at the polling places. And that was able to address a lot of the gaps. But by that point, all of the consolidation had already happened, so they weren't able to add additional polling places. Consolidation also raises some other questions about notifying voters. So we had to make sure we were working with the clerks in those jurisdictions to notify their voters, either by inputting that data in our statewide system so they could look it up online, or by putting physical notices on the doors of usual polling places so that if people did arrive there, they knew where to go. And so that was part of those efforts. In terms of looking ahead to November, so now that we've had this opportunity to recognize some of the challenges that will be faced, I think we can help the jurisdictions identify if they are consolidating where they can look at historic turnout to figure out exactly how that consolidation should work, what wards and what reporting units should be paired together to make sure that they're able to offer the best services to their jurisdictions.
You mentioned something that I found really interesting, and other people have too. It's the National Guard. Now, this wasn't soldiers with guns showing up at the polling places. So could you say a little bit about how that worked with the National Guard?
Working with the National Guard, you know, it was a great experience from the perspective of our local election officials, and I think how it actually played out was very different than voters or local election officials had anticipated it would look. So the program that was used was to put out calls for National Guard service members to serve as poll workers within their home communities. So we do have some laws that restrict certain jobs at the polls to residents of that county. So the call was made within each county for people that serve in the Guard to serve as poll workers. They were on active duty as they were training and as they were working on election day, but they were in plain clothes and they were serving in places like their hometown as poll workers in traditional poll worker roles. So they weren't doing additional things like crowd control or law enforcement. They were working as greeters, helping with hand sanitation, helping with set up the polling place, maybe even helping with registration. And we developed a series of online training tutorials that they were able to take the day that they were put onto orders. So they had an intake process on the Sunday before the election where they check in, they do a health screening, all those things to go on active duty. And then they also took all of the election training so that they were able to serve in any of the roles at the polling place on election day, depending on how what they were needed for. We also did a little cross-leveling. So as service members reported on Monday to the municipality where they were going to be working to do additional training, there were some places that found that they had a need for more, and there were some places that found that they had a need for less. And so we were able to reassign some of the Guard members to other communities to help them fill those gaps as well. And overall, it was just a very positive experience for our local election officials. They sent their gratitude over the last few days that they wanted to make sure that the service members got, because it really was a great experience, and also one where they're very hopeful that these National Guard service members will also be willing to serve in that capacity in the future as well, because again, these are their neighbors, their friends, their family, their people from their communities. And so we're hopeful that that really helped to grow our pool of eligible poll workers.
That's great. And the last question, which of course we could probably spend hours talking about, but we're only going to spend a couple of minutes, and that has to do with mail balloting. And I think that got a lot of attention. Just the number of mail ballots in Wisconsin at this time was historically high by any measure. I think our focus here is really kind of what we learned in Wisconsin and thinking about November. So from your perspective, what are the takeaways, assuming that there's going to be even more mail balloting in the fall, as y'all, but especially the local jurisdictions, prepare for a much greater volume in November?
There's certainly a lot of lessons that we've learned in terms of how we can expand the program. So when this COVID-19 crisis really began and the orders started to come into place in our state, the election was well underway. So we were more than halfway through the balloting process for the April 7th election. And so adjustments just weren't possible, especially technical adjustments to our system to allow sort of expanded transparency into the by-mail system or efficiencies. We couldn't make those changes, right? Because our systems were in change freezes and other things where we couldn't make changes that might impact the other functionalities, the basics that run elections. And so, we were able to identify a lot of places where hopefully, as we look ahead to the rest of this year, we do have another election on May 12th in 526 of our jurisdictions for a vacant congressional seat. But we're hopeful that this summer we can think through things to help us create efficiencies, allow voters more opportunities to track their ballots, and allow clerks a more centralized place to be able to track and to distribute those ballots as well. So right now, all 1,850, they send out the ballots in their local townships or their cities or their villages. And so we really think that there might be some better, more efficient ways to help them with that process. And again, to ensure that voters have real-time tracking to be able to understand exactly where their ballot's at in the process.
This wouldn't be a state takeover of the mail system, but it would be providing functionality that could assist the local jurisdictions in doing their jobs, right?
Exactly. Many of our smaller communities, they would only send out a handful of ballots. We have some really small election jurisdictions, and so they may have seen historically 10 ballots that they were sending out by mail absentee in the past, and now they were dealing with hundreds. And so, yeah, it's always going to be a duty that's held by the local election official. Our statutes make them the custodians and the gatekeepers of absentee voting, but there are some efficiencies and some advanced tracking that we can help them with, I think, as we look towards the future. Great,
thanks. I'm going to turn to you, Barry, and to do a bit of political science side on this. A number of issues that come up in observing an election that has some, kind of unsettled aspects to it, and there's been a lot of speculation out there about what those effects might be. One of those is turnout, and you've studied turnout a lot in your professional career, written about it. So and we don't know yet exactly what the overall turnout effects were, but we can probably guess from what we know in political science. So how do you think through the likely effects, and what are you looking for as you anticipate getting the data that you could actually analyze?
Well, we know from political science research there are things that are part of the election administration process that affect turnout. but also plenty of things, maybe more important things that are outside that apparatus that affect turnout. In particular, there's research on how economic downturns, like the one we're experiencing now, might affect turnout. Research that I've done with Amber Wachowski actually shows that when unemployment rises, as it has over the last couple of weeks, turnout tends to respond in a positive way. It tends to go up rather than down. And that seems to be a response to the kind of stimulus that many people are experiencing, in a sense that they want to express their unhappiness with the situation. And because it's widespread enough, it's not viewed as an idiosyncratic problem for the individual. It's viewed as a communal or governmental problem that deserves some larger response. So that factor alone, we might expect turnout to rise a bit, but we also know people were affected by their health. Some people were hospitalized, others feared they had the virus. Many didn't want to go outside, they were advised not to. And there are separate studies showing that poor health or health problems or disabilities and illnesses tend to deter turnout. So you have those two forces that are beyond the control of election officials really working at odds with one another. I think the other way to think about things on the election administration side is to look at research on the resources that voters have to navigate the voting system. In particular, the absentee voting process, which was so heavily used this past week, over 1.2 million ballots issued that way. That was a brand new experience for most voters. Mail voting had been at very low rates in Wisconsin, typically below 10% of total ballots cast. And so that became a kind of new experience for voters. And some of them were better able to navigate it because they had done it before, or they had lots of resources or other people they could turn to for assistance. So for them, I think for people in that category, turnout probably was not impacted much. And the ease with which they could request the absentee ballot really facilitated that. But there are other voters who would have more challenge navigating that process. Most voters need a voter ID that's approved by the state in order to request the absentee ballot in the first place. That would have been a challenge for some voters. And then Wisconsin's one of a small number of states that requires a witness signature on the absentee ballot envelope. That's challenging for people who live alone or who are isolated to try to get the signature in a safe fashion or at all and get that ballot back on time. And then as a college professor, the other group I think about are college students. There are over 100,000 students just in the UW system, and they were mostly displaced from their residential campuses back to parents' homes in most cases. Some of them would have requested absentee ballots before the displacement, and so would have had to request a new one or hope that the mail was forwarded. Others would have been requesting the ballot sent to a different place than where they're registered potentially. All of this for a set of people who are young and don't have much experience with the voting process. So I think for people in their high teens and 20s, the process would have been especially challenging and new.
Yeah. So a special bonus question on this. The people who vote in primaries tend to be different than people who vote in general elections. So then kind of thinking through, we might say we can learn some things from the primary, but it is going to be a different electorate in November as well. You have thoughts about that and how, the new mail ballot regime might affect things?
Yeah, it looks like there were a little over a million ballots in this election, maybe 1.3 million absentee ballots, plus some in person. But in a general election, we might see 3 million votes cast, much higher number, and a different kind of voter, as you say, what political scientists would call a peripheral voter, who is less tuned into the day-to-day politics, tends to be less capable in terms of having resources to navigate the voting process, and will have to learn that. And if it's a new process in November because of a continued emphasis on mail voting, that will be a challenge. On the other hand, I think there were a lot of peripheral voters who got sucked into this election because aside from the coronavirus news, it was the major news item in Wisconsin for several weeks. Would the state hold a primary? What was happening in the courts? At one point, there were 4 or maybe 5 lawsuits happening simultaneously. So anyone who was part of conversation or attending to the news would have heard about what was going on with the election. And there was really a bipartisan message from elected officials and also from clerks and from the Elections Commission to use the absentee voting process. So my guess is that that actually stimulated some people who would not have otherwise voted to turn out, simply because it was one of the things that was going on that wasn't virus related.
Right. Well, so then that gets to the kind of inside baseball, inside political science question of, well, how will we know this? And you're a real professional in opening up the hood of the Wisconsin election car and analyzing things. So what sort of data is available for people who want to take a look at the actual effects, and what are you going to be looking at in the next couple of days and weeks when it becomes available?
Well, I think there'll be two data sources that will be most helpful. One is the aggregate results that the Elections Commission will eventually have posted on the website, ward by ward reporting of vote totals and the means by which people voted and the degree to which they use things like election day registration, voted in person versus voting absentee. The other is that the voter file itself, the statewide voter registration database, contains voter histories for all registered voters. And so that's a way to track people moving in and out of the system or from one mode of voting to another over time. I think what's frustrating is that we don't have a perfect comparison election. Everyone is searching for an election that's like this one to see what the effects were. But as we go back through the last 5 or 10 years of elections in Wisconsin, there isn't one that quite has this mix of a presidential primary, of mild interest on one side that would have brought out some Democrats, no presidential primary on the other side, a very heated Supreme Court race, competitive and very interesting races going on in Milwaukee City for mayor and Milwaukee County for county executive. And just that combination of things doesn't exist in the same way in just about any other election. And yet we know it's the races, as you said at the top of this piece, that drive voter interest. And so I think it's going to be challenging to do a kind of before and after. And it may be that a more granular look at the voter file or that particular wards will be most useful.
Thanks. So the last topic I want to explore, at least very briefly, is one that might bring together the two perspectives. The MIT Election Data and Science Lab, one of our goals is to foster collaborations between election officials and academic researchers and other researchers. And I know there's actually been many fruitful collaborations in Wisconsin of these sorts. And so I'm just curious, what are the opportunities for election officials and researchers to work together to figure out what to do in November or in general to improve elections? And I'll start with, I'll put Meagan on the hot seat. How could you and your colleagues be assisted by researchers to improve things for November?
Sure. Well, I'm very comfortable in the hot seat, so this is just fine. One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of a collaboration is if we continue to see the shift to more voters choosing to vote by mail, the need for polling places and the need to identify where they should be becomes much more significant. And so, as we look ahead to getting that data about turnout, where people went, what types of, there probably won't be the need for as many polling places. And so where should the polling places that are needed, where should they be? Where do we need to make sure that those are available to people? And so I could see as the additional data becomes available to us, doing some of that analysis to help our jurisdictions, to help the local election officials understand where they should make sure that they have those available opportunities for in-person voting as well. Again, this model shifted so quickly and there wasn't really a comparable election for us to point to. And so there wasn't really a lot of data to help them in making those decisions. And so maybe looking forward, that would be a really great place to collaborate to give them some more direction on where those in-person opportunities are still needed.
And Barry, what are your thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I think that's certainly an important question, especially in a state that had to ramp up mail voting so quickly and really didn't have the time to prepare to think about polling place numbers or locations in a way that other states that slowly came around to mail voting were able to do over the course of some years. I think there are a whole range of questions that deserve investigation where election officials or the commission and academics could work together, not just to understand what happened here, but to provide useful evidence to other states. With Wisconsin as the guinea pig in April, at least for states that are holding primaries in May, June, and now July, to think about best practices that would work there. One of the things we'll be looking for is the return of absentee ballots, which are still coming in until Monday. I think there's a lot to be learned there from, how many of those come in late compared to other elections where people have voted by mail, and to what degree they're rejected for reasons such as signatures being missed or envelopes not being sealed. We have a lot of good data on that from around the country, from the EAC. And I think putting this exceptional election in that context could be really helpful for clerks in thinking about the kind of messaging they want to get out to voters. That's also true for the Elections Commission. I think kind of the getting out front of the next election based on what we learned from this one will be really helpful.
Great, thanks. And thanks to both of you. This has been a really great conversation. We could keep it going forever, but we have our lives to live, and Meagan has an election still to wrap up. And so thank you both for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks to both of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, as Charles said. And thanks to all of you who are out there watching. If you'd like to know more about the things we talked about today or about elections and COVID-19 more broadly, check the links that are in the description box below. If you'd like to know when the next video goes live, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, stay safe out there.